Hello, 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 everyone. My name is John Sierra, and I'm a Tolkien scholar. And what that essentially means is that I'm the kind of guy that you can come to with any sort of question about any of J.R.R. Tolkien's works, whether it's The Hobbit, or The Lord of the Rings, or The Silmarillion, or any of its satellite stories. I'm generally the guy you can come to and you're like, I have a question about that part, this and that. And I've answered, thousands of questions at this point, both here and on Quora. If you want to ask me a question, you can feel free to just leave me a comment at any time and I'll answer it when I can. But if you want to be featured in a video, the best way to do that is to go through a website called, as I mentioned, Quora. So Quora is a knowledge-sharing platform where you can ask any question that you wish and have people with relevant experience or expertise or wisdom or any sort of person actually answer you, although generally you try to get people who can answer the question. And the way that works is when you ask a question, it automatically detects what topics you're writing about, say Tolkien or The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbit or whatever, or Middle-earth sometimes is a topic, and then it gives you a list of people that you could specifically ask them the question, tagging them in that and send them a request. If you ask any sort of Tolkien-related question on Quora, my name is going to be at or near the top of that list. Or easy, you can just go in the description for this very video, and in there is a link to my Quora account as well as my Quora space, which is called the Grey Havens, where it's not just me, it's a bunch of other people answering questions as well. Anyway, and I should mention that it's not a guarantee. Sometimes somebody will say, hey, you didn't answer my question, and that doesn't necessarily mean that it was a bad question. Sometimes I like to sit on a question for a while. Sometimes I need to sit on a question for a while because it requires a lot of research. Not all this is done off the top of my head. Sometimes I'm like, that's a good question, but I did just talk about it very recently, so I don't want to sort of repeat myself too often, so I'll sit on it for a while, or even sometimes decline it because it gets repetitive. But I do try to answer all the questions that come through to me, as long as they're reasonable. Sometimes I get silly questions, and yes, sometimes I do indulge myself in the silly questions. Like there was one where somebody asked who would win in a... they didn't even say in a fight. That was the whole point of it. They said who would win, Fingolfin, of course, a character from the Silmarillion, or Captain America. And I thought, that's so strange, that's so bizarre, But they didn't say fight, they didn't say in a battle, so I thought, well, this will be funny, and I sort of made it like, well, it was a drinking contest, and then I came up with a few other silly contests that the two of them could compete in and wrote a very silly article. Sometimes I will absolutely do that, but I do try to give my priority to questions that are thoughtful or meaningful, and I have been getting a lot of great ones, so I want to thank you guys for that. And for subscribing, I'm going to ask that you subscribe to my channel if you haven't already. I'm going to ask you again at the end of the video in case you think, who does this guy think he is asking me to subscribe, only a few minutes into the video. That's silly. I don't know if I like him yet or not. Well, I'll ask you again at the end, because if you make it all the way to the end, I think you kind of have to. And of course, leave me a comment, hit the like button. All these things help drive engagement and get the channel shown to more people. I do have 10 questions to get to this week, and of course I have a reading. And I had decided that I wanted to read one of J.R.R. Tolkien's letters. There are two letters that I come back to time and time again. Letter 131 and letter, I want to say 158, somewhere around there. The one that I'm going to read is letter 131, which was to a fellow by the name of Milton Waldman. Now, I don't have my physical copy handy, so I'm going to be reading this from a PDF, which is why there's a white glow on my face right now, because I just brought it up. The other letter, I believe it's 158, was to Peter Hastings. That is probably my favorite of Tolkien's letters, and it's one that I come back to time and time and time again. But it's way too long to read for just a reading. One day, of course, I will do reading streams of his letters and talk about that. But this is letter 131 to Milton Waldman. Now, this one comes with a little bit of a preamble so you can sort of understand the backstory here. So I'm going to read that part first. After Alan and Unwin, under pressure from Tolkien to make up their minds, had reluctantly declined to publish The Lord of the Rings together with the Silmarillion, Tolkien was confident that Milton Waldman of Collins would shortly issue both books under his firm's imprint. In the spring of 1950, Waldman told Tolkien that he hoped to begin typesetting the following autumn, but there were delays largely caused by Waldman's frequent absences in Italy and his ill health. By the latter part of 1951, no definite arrangements for publication had yet been made, and Collins was becoming anxious about the combined length of both books. It was apparently at Waldman's suggestion that Tolkien wrote the following letter, of which the full text is some 10,000 words long, with the intention of demonstrating that The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion were interdependent and indivisible. The letter, which interested Waldman so much that he had a typed copy made, see the end of number 137, it is not dated, but it was probably written late in 1951. So here we go. My dearest Milton, you ask for a brief sketch of my stuff that is connected with my imaginary world. It is difficult to say anything without saying too much. The attempts to say a few words opens a floodgate of excitement. The egoist and artist at once desires to say how the stuff is grown, what it is like, and what he thinks he means or is trying to represent by it all. I shall inflict some of this on you, but I will append a more resume of its contents, which is, maybe, all that you want or will have use or time for. In order of time growth and composition, the stuff began with me, though I do not suppose that it is of much interest to anyone but myself. I mean, I do not remember a time when I was not building it. Many children make up or begin to make up imaginary languages. I have been at it since I could write. But I have never stopped, and of course, as a professional philologist, especially interested in linguistic aesthetics, I have changed in taste, improved in theory, and probably in craft. Behind my stories is now a nexus of languages, mostly only structurally sketched, but to those creatures which in English I call misleadingly elves, are assigned two related languages more nearly completed, whose history is written and whose forms, representing two different sides of my own linguistic taste, are deduced scientifically from a common origin. Out of these languages are made nearly all the names that appear in my legends. This gives a certain character, a cohesion, a consistency of linguistic style, and an illusion of historicity to the nomenclature, or so I believe, that is mistakenly lacking in other comparable things. Not all will feel this is as important as I do, since I am cursed by acute sensibility in such matters. But an equally basic passion of mine ab initio was for myth, not allegory, and for fairy story, and above all for heroic legend on the brink of fairy tale and history, of which there is far too little in the world accessible to me for my appetite. I was an undergraduate before I thought and experience revealed to me that there were not divergent interests, opposite poles of science and romance, but integrally related. I am not learned in the matters of myth and fairy story, however, for in such things, as far as known to me, I have always been seeking material, things of a certain tone, air, and not simple knowledge. Also, and here I hope I shall not sound absurd, I was from early days grieved by the poverty of my own beloved country. It had no stories of its own, bound up with its tongue and soil, not of the quality I sought, and found as an ingredient in legends of other lands. There was Greek and Celtic and Romance, Germanic, Scandinavian, and Finnish, which greatly affected me, but nothing English, save impoverished chapbook stuff. Of course, there was, and is, all the Arthurian world, but powerful as it is imperfectly naturalized, associating with the soil of Britain, but not with English, and does not replace what I feel to be missing. For one thing, its fairy is too lavish and fantastical, incoherent and repetitive. For another and more important thing, it is involved in and explicitly contains the Christian religion. For reasons which I will not elaborate, that seems to me fatal. Myth and fairy story must, as all art, reflect and contain in solution elements of moral and religious truth or error, but not explicit, not known in the form of primary real world. I am speaking, of course, of our present situation, not of ancient pagan pre-Christian days. And I will not repeat what I tried to say in my essay, which you read. Do not laugh. But once upon a time, my crest has long since fallen, I had a mind to make a body of more or less connected legend, ranging from the large and cosmogonic to the level of romantic fairy story, the latter founded in the lesser in contact with the earth, the lesser drawing splendor from the vast backcloths, which I could dedicate simply to England and to my country. It should possess the tone and quality that I desired, somewhat cool and clear, be redolent of our air, the clime and soil of the northwest, meaning Britain and the hither parts of Europe, not Italy or the Aegean, still less the east, and while possessing, if I could achieve it, the fair elusive beauty that some call Celtic, though it is rarely found in genuine ancient Celtic things. It should be high, purged of the gross, and fit for the more adult mind of a land long now steeped in poetry. I would draw some of the great tales in fullness, and leave many only placed in the scheme, and sketched. The cycle should be linked to a majestic whole, and yet leave scope for other minds and hands, wielding paint and music and drama. Absurd. Of course, such an overweening purpose did not develop all at once. The mere stories were the thing. They arose in my mind as given things, and as they came separately, so too the links grew. An absorbing, though continually interrupted labor, especially since even apart from the necessities of life, the mind would wing to the other pole and spend itself on the linguistics. Yet always I had the sense of recording that there already were there, somewhere, not of inventing. Of course I made up and even wrote lots of other things, especially for my children. Some escaped from the grasp of this branching, acquisitive theme, being ultimately and radically unrelated, Leaf by Neagle and Farmer Giles, for instance, the only two that have been printed. The Hobbit, which has more essential life in it, was quite independently conceived. I did not know as I began it that it belonged, but it proved to be the discovery of the completion of the whole, its mode of descent to earth and merging into history. As the high legends of the beginning are supposed to look at things through elvish minds, so the middle tale of The Hobbit takes a virtually human point of view, and the last tale blends them. I dislike allegory, the conscious and intentional allegory, yet any attempt to explain the purport of myth or fairy tale must use allegorical language, and of course the more life a story has, the more readily it will be susceptible of allegorical interpretations, while the better to a deliberate allegory is made, the more nearly will it be acceptable as just a story. Anyway, all this stuff is mainly concerned with fall, mortality, and the machine. With fall, inevitably, and that motive occurs in several modes. With mortality, especially as it affects art and the creative, or I should say sub-creative desire, which seems to have no biological function, and to be apart from the satisfactions of plain, ordinary biological life, with which, in our world, it is indeed usually at strife. This desire is at once wedded to a passionate love of the real primary world, and hence filled with the sense of mortality, yet unsatisfied by it. It has various opportunities of fall. It may become possessive, clinging to the things made as its own. The sub-creator wishes to be the lord and god of his private creation. He will rebel against the laws of the creator, especially against mortality. Both of these, alone or together, will lead to the desire for power, for making the will more quickly effective, and so to the machine, or magic. By the last I intend all use of external plans or devices, apparatus, instead of development of the inherent inner powers of talents, or even the use of these talents with a corrupted motive of dominating, bulldozing the real world, or coercing other wills. The machine is our more obvious modern form, though more closely related to magic than it is usually recognized. I have not used magic consistently, and indeed the elven queen Galadriel is obliged to remonstrate with the hobbits on their confused use of the word, both for the devices and operations of the enemy, and for those of the elves. I have not, because there is not a word for the latter, since all human stories have suffered the same confusion. But the elven are there in my tales to demonstrate the difference. Their magic is art, delivered from many of its human limitations, more effortless, more quick, more complete, product in vision and unflawed correspondence. And its object is art, not power, subcreation, not domination and tyrannous reforming of creation. The elves are immortal, at least as far as this world goes, and hence are concerned rather with the griefs and burdens of deathlessness and time and change than with death. The enemy, in successive forms, is always naturally concerned with sheer domination, and so the lord of magic and machines. But the problem that this frightful evil can and does arise from an apparently good root, the desire to benefit the world and others speedily and according to the benefactor's own plans, is a recurrent motive. The cycles begin with a cosmogonical myth, the music of the Ainur. God and the Valar, or powers, Englished as gods, are revealed. These latter are, as we should say, angelic powers, whose function is to exercise delegated authority in the spheres of rule and government, not creation, making or remaking. They are divine, that is, were originally outside and existed before the making of the world. Their power and wisdom is derived from their knowledge of the cosmogonical drama, which they perceive first as a drama, that is, in a fashion we perceive a story comprised by someone else, and later as a reality. On the side of mere narrative device, this is of course meant to provide things of the same order of beauty, power, and majesty as the gods of higher mythology, which can yet be accepted. Well, shall we say badly, by a mind that believes in the Blessed Trinity. It moves then swiftly to the history of the elves, or the Silmarillion proper, to the world as we perceive it, but of course transfigured in a still half-mythical mode, that is, it deals with rational incarnate creatures of more or less comparable stature with our own. The knowledge of the creation, drama, was incomplete in each individual god, and incomplete if all the knowledge of the pantheon were pooled, for partly to redress the evil of the rebel Melkor, partly for the completion of all the ultimate finesse of detail. The Creator had not revealed all. The making and nature of the children of God were the two chief secrets. All that the gods knew was that they would come at appointed times. The children of God are thus primarily related to and akin and primevally different, since also they are something wholly other to the gods, in the making of which the gods played no part. They are the object of that special desire and love of the gods. They are the firstborn, the elves, and the followers, men. The doom of the elves is to be immortal, to love the beauty of the world, and to bring it to full flower with their gifts of delicacy and perfection, to last while it lasts, never leaving it, even when slain, but returning. And yet, when the followers come, to teach them, and to make way for them, to fade as the followers grow and absorb the life from which both proceed. The doom, or the gift of man, is mortality, freedom from the circles of the world. Since the point of view of the whole cycle is the elvish, mortality is not explained mythically. It is a mystery of God, of which no more is known than that what God has purposed for men is hidden, a grief and an envy to the immortal elves. As I say, the legendary Silmarillion is peculiar, and differs from all similar things that I know in not being anthropocentric. Its center of view and interest is not men, but elves. Men come in inevitably. After all, the author is a man, and if he has an audience, they will be men, and men must come in our tales as such, and not merely transfigured or partially represented as elves, dwarves, hobbits, etc., but they remain peripheral, latecomers, and however growingly important, not principals. In the cosmogony there is a fall of angels, we should say, though quite different in form, of course, to that of Christian myth. These tales are new. They are not directly derived from other myths and legends, but they must inevitably contain a large measure of ancient widespread motives or elements. After all, I believe that legends and myths are largely made of truth, and indeed present aspects of it that can only be received in this mode. And long ago, certain truths and modes of this kind were discovered and must always reappear. There cannot be any story without a fall. All stories are ultimately about the fall, at least not for human minds as we know them and have them. So there's quite a bit more. As I mentioned there in the preamble, it is like 10,000 words long, and I was never going to get through the whole thing. But there you see, it's very interesting because Tolkien comes off in a rather interesting way in this letter. He's partly a bit maudlin because he's been wanting to proceed with The Lord of the Rings and the Silmarillion as a single connected work, maybe not necessarily sold as a single volume, but created, printed, and sold at the same time. And of course that didn't happen. The Silmarillion wasn't published until after his death and in an unfinished state. And I think, had they agreed to this, then he would have probably had a version that was finished, and it would have escaped, and it would have been out with The Lord of the Rings, and it would have been very different from the one we got, of course. But you can see here where he's saying, I'm a little bit, like, hey, I've always wanted to do this, and I'm crestfallen. My crest has long since fallen, and my dreams are somewhat absurd. To sort of create this vaguely Celtic sort of myth, and there's a bit of a misunderstanding here. People say that he wanted to create a mythology of England. He wanted to create a mythology and dedicate it to England. And he wanted it to be steeped in English poetry in the land of England. But he even admits there are myths of England. There of course was Arthurian legend, and there's a bunch of others, but he doesn't find them particularly satisfying as much as he finds the Germanic and the Romantic and the Finnish and such like that, and the Finnish especially, you know. And then we get, you know, a little bit of so we get the maudlin sort of like, oh man, you know, Unwin and, you know, Alan, they were going to do it, and then they said they wouldn't, and maybe you'll do it, and of course that didn't happen either. But here, you know, and then he gets excited, and it's like, hey, you want me to tell you about my mythology? Oh man, I could talk to you, you know, about that for days, and I'm gonna do that to you for a little while. I'm gonna inflict it upon you, you know. And he talks about the beginning, the Ainu Lindale, and the Silmarillion, the history of the elves, and he goes on to talk about the Lord of the Rings and everything later on. Like I said, it's a very long letter. I just wanted to give like the first bit of it. Of course, one day I'll have to read the whole thing for you guys in a stream. But it's very interesting to sort of see Tolkien sort of alternating between being very excited to talk about this stuff and being sort of a little bit depressed almost that he feels it's not going to happen the way that he wants it to happen. That, you know, the opportunities to publish the Silmarillion are not happening, and this one guy is saying, hey, write me a letter, you know, sort of explaining the whole thing, but this guy is getting nervous about how long it's going to be. And it's funny because the Silmarillion is that's not the Silmarillion. Oh, here it is. What's interesting is that it looks like a really big book. You know, it looks like quite the big volume here, but if we look at it, it's less than 400 pages. It's 358. Yeah, 358. And that's including, you know, the index at the end there. So if we ignore the index and just go by the actual story, the index is... Okay, we're going to also ignore the pronunciation guide and the tables here. So the end of the Silmarillion is on page 292, so it's less than 300 pages long compared to the Lord of the Rings, which wound up being 1,200 pages long, which he also found to be too short. He thought the Lord of the Rings was far too short. It should have been longer in his own mind. But of course, if he was allowed unlimited time to work on it, he probably never would have finished it. He would have tinkered it up until the day he died, and we would have gotten, you know, something edited by his son maybe. But there might not have been as much demand for it because, you know, then it was like, okay, well, The Hobbit was in the 30s and now we're in the mid-70s, and are we really, you know, like, what demand is there? There was a lot of demand for Unfinished Tales and the Silmarillion and all this stuff because of the Lord of the Rings. The Lord of the Rings was very big, especially in the 60s. In the 50s, when it was released, it was a bit of a slow burn, but it became very popular in the 60s, and then onwards, you know, after his death, it became much more popular. But anyway, guys, like I said, we have 10 questions to get to, so let's start with those and get to your first question. Our first question comes in by the request of Samuel Moore, and I think this is a really good question. He asks, how reliable is The Lord of the Rings as an in-universe historical account of the War of the Ring? How do we know that the hobbits did or did not embellish or exaggerate anything? Very good question. I love this question. I would state that the account written largely by Frodo is probably, I'm going to say, 99% accurate. The difference between the story as written of The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings was nearly night and day in terms of tone. There was, you know, this was intentional by the author. He's publishing to an older audience. The Hobbit is, you know, that this was in the 30s and now it's the 50s, so he's got to figure all the children that read The Hobbit are grown up now, or at least the ones that read it in the 30s. It remained to be a popular book after that. But in the universe, it could be chalked up to Frodo and his friends having a different writing style than Bilbo did. Bilbo's story was told unilaterally. There was no input from anybody else, and contains a lot of what I would say fanciful exaggerations. There's alterations, there's omissions, to the point that Gandalf commented that if he had written the story, it would be very different. Of course, Gandalf would be unable to write the entire story because he wasn't present for the entirety of The Hobbit. But for the parts that he witnessed, he felt that Bilbo changed things to make it more of a story that he could tell to young hobbits. Thus we have, like, scenes like the three trolls having, and there were three trolls, I'm sure, but they had these very English-sounding names, including one with a full name, William Huggins, which is ridiculous. Why would a troll have a surname like that? Other parts were likely altered to change the perception of certain characters, most notably Thorin Oakenshield, who Gandalf described as being a lot nastier than how he was portrayed by Bilbo. We talked at length about that in the previous episode. Gandalf wonders aloud whether Bilbo was oblivious or how distasteful Thorin, acted in Bag End, or maybe Bilbo, who later became friends with Thorin later on, wanted to make him look a bit better in his books, so he toned it down. The Lord of the Rings, though, it's different. It's a much larger scale story and it's much more important as a historical chronicle. When we have, Gandalf giving alternate accounts for some bits of The Hobbit in the story The Quest of Erebor, the only alternate take on the Lord of the Rings is of the Rings of Power in the Third Age. And while it is a less detailed and much shorter account, it should be noted that not a single thing in it contradicts the text as written. It's important to note that Frodo did not write unilaterally, as seen here. I'm going to read you the part of the Lord of the Rings in Book 6 where the title of the book is revealed. Here Bilbo's hand ended, and Frodo had written, "The downfall of the Lord of the Rings and the return of the king, as seen by the little people, being the memoirs of Bilbo and Frodo of the Shire, supplemented by the accounts of their friends and the learning of the wise, together with extracts from books of lore translated by Bilbo in Rivendell." So, while it is the story as seen by the little people, there's nothing to suggest vast alterations. Bilbo and Frodo are given top billing, but notes supplemented by the accounts of their friends and the learning of the wise. There are parts of the story that are obviously written by Frodo, and there are parts of it in the very beginning that are obviously written by Bilbo, but I would hazard a very strong surmise that everything from Cirith Ungol onwards was largely written by Sam, or at least recounted by Sam to Frodo, as it is almost always his point of view from then on. There were also vast parts of the story that Frodo and Sam were not a part of. Surely all the parts in Rohan were told by Merry, and a great deal of the Gondor portion was told by Pippin. Other members of the Fellowship would have pitched in parts. I would guess that Gimli told most of the story of the three hunters as he hung out with the hobbits during the telling of the Quest of Erebor. Even parts of Unfinished Tales not related to the Quest of Erebor seem to have been informed by Gimli, such as Aragorn discovering Saruman's secret chamber in Orthanc. So, for friends, the storytellers are likely primarily Sam, Merry, Pippin, and Gimli, and I would dare say that Legolas and Aragorn may, offer their perspectives on certain points. Gimli is the most interesting thing, part of this to me, because out of all of the dwarves portrayed in The Hobbit by Bilbo, Gimli's father, Gloin, comes off as sort of the rudest to Bilbo, and even as Gandalf revealed how nasty Thorin actually was in Bag End, he also gave us another bit of additional rudeness from Gloin, who referred to the Shire as a land of simpletons. Gimli was mentioned to have likely traveled through the Shire at one point, and was likely told by his own father how his perception of Bilbo, and hobbits in general, and the Shire as a land changed greatly. Note that when Bilbo first volunteers to take the One Ring to Mordor, Boromir, he starts to laugh like this old guy is gonna go there. And then he quickly kind of corrects himself because he notes the reverence for Bilbo in the room. And it was noted that the general reaction was shock, except for Gloin, who smiled quietly. Gloin took sort of a hard turn from hobbits are simpletons, and this Bilbo is more of a grocer than a burglar. And then he's smiling at the 128-year-old hobbit volunteering to walk to Mordor, which of course he wasn't going to. Gloin's function is almost like a stand-in for the late Thorin Oakenshield. He's giving Bilbo the respect of someone who shared in his adventure, but of course Gloin is one that survived. It's also mentioned the learning of the wise. We have to talk about that. And it's a capital W, and that suggests Gandalf more than anybody. He does take over a large portion of the narrative in the Council of Elrond, after all, and probably filled in a lot of gaps to Frodo when they were in Minas Tirith. After all, of this, it is mentioned that this also includes extracts from books of lore that Bilbo translated, which would comprise the unfinished Silmarillion. I have noted in the past that the Silmarillion contains errors, likely made by Bilbo in translation, such as saying that Arenian Gil-galad was the son of Fingon, and some occasional editorializing. This means that of the Rings of Power in the Third Age was contained in the very same volume that Frodo wrote in. When we look at the real-life history of the last chapter of the Silmarillion, this tells us that Frodo's account was accurate. Tolkien originally called the story The Rings of Power, and it was meant to be a bridge between the Silmarillion and his Third Age stories, The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings. He mentions it in letter 115 before the publication of The Lord of the Rings, and then later in letter 131, which I read a bit from earlier, when lamenting that he cannot publish the Silmarillion and The Lord of the Rings as a single note, and gives an accounting of the entire story, again calling it The Rings of Power and intending to link the two works. I didn't get to that part in my reading, but that's later on in the letter. The history of this text started from an early version of the Council of Elrond, where the majority of the Rings of Power story was relayed by Elrond, and of course up to that point, not including the bits about the fall of Sauron and the ascension of Aragorn, because it hadn't happened yet. This marks, I would say, Elrond is the likely author of that section of the Silmarillion, the story of the Rings of Power, which later got renamed Of the Rings of Power in the Third Age. And we can safely say that Elrond had a bit of a hand in guiding some of Frodo's writings as one of the wise. We can also give some likely credit to Galadriel. She spent a lot of time with Frodo and Sam traveling north before they separated. The account of this trip is largely undetailed, except for the section that concerns Saruman and Grima. So I would say it's highly likely that their nights were spent in council, and Frodo and Sam would be filling in Galadriel and Celeborn on some things, and they would receive wisdom in return. So though Frodo wrote the vast bit of The Lord of the Rings, with the beginning and the end bookmarked by Bilbo and Sam respectively, we must understand that many others had a hand in writing the in-universe text. The reason that I state it's 99% accurate and not say 100% accurate is that even with so many authors and so many hands in the pot, there's still bound to be at least a hint of bias in certain passages. Some characters are seen largely through the lens of the hobbits, with context given later on. Boromir, for example, he wasn't around. He died, so he couldn't have any sort of hand in giving context to his words and his actions, so we view them only from the lens of those who witnessed his actions, from the little people. So there we go. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question was sent in anonymously, and here it is. How were the 3 elven rings able to resist Sauron's corruption when all the other rings were affected by his power? Well, that's the neat thing. They didn't. A lot of noise is made about how the 3 rings, Vilya, Nenya, and Narya, are unique due to the fact that they were never touched by Sauron, while the other 16 rings of power were. And this is true. They were made by Celebrimbor after Annatar left Eregion, in a period when Celebrimbor did not know that Annatar was Sauron. The 3 were never touched by Sauron and were unknown to him until he made the One Ring, upon which he became aware of them. That's the part of the poem, One Ring to Find Them. They were said to be the greatest of the rings in terms of power, though their power was made to repel evil and defend against the ravages of time and decay. The 3 were not immune to Sauron's power, however. The One Ring was the ring to rule them all, not the One Ring to rule some. The reason that Sauron failed to use them to his advantage was simple. As soon as the One Ring was forged and enchanted, the elves sensed him and took off their rings. Celebrimbor heard the voice of Sauron enchanting the One Ring through the 3. He took the 3 rings to Lothlorien, where he spoke to Galadriel, asking for advice, and Galadriel gave Celebrimbor the advice to keep them safe and keep them hidden and not to use them. They couldn't do much good to the elves, but she didn't want them to fall into Sauron's hands. Celebrimbor gave her one of the rings, Nenya, the ring of adamant, and he took the other 2 to Lindon to give to his high king, Arenian Gil-galad. And of course, Gil-galad, he kept one of the rings, Vilya, the ring of air, and he gave Narya, the ring of fire, to Círdan the mariner. While Galadriel, Gil-galad, and Círdan possessed these rings, they didn't use them. They didn't even wear them. They were merely keeping them safe and secret. Before setting off to Mordor, Gil-galad gave Vilya to Elrond, perhaps foreseeing his own death and subsequent trip to the west. After the fall of Sauron and the subsequent death of Isildur, the One Ring was believed to have been lost. With no one acting as the Lord of the Rings, it was safe for these rings to be used, which Círdan, Elrond, and Galadriel did for many years. Círdan wound up secretly passing Narya to Gandalf. Galadriel explained how it all works to Frodo, and how if Frodo failed in his quest, Sauron would, of course, he would regain the One Ring, and she would have to forsake the use of her own, because it's not immune to Sauron's power, and that would make her realm a lot less safe. The converse here is that if Frodo succeeds and destroys the one, the power of the three would fall. This is the part of the poem, bind them. And thus her realm would fade anyway. So this is the reason that Galadriel had been tempted to just find some sort of fault with Frodo as a ring bearer and take the One Ring for him and to use it to defeat Sauron herself. However, he sort of did the reverse Uno card here, and he offered it to her, or at least he stated that he would surrender it to her if she asked. This made her reflect on the fact that if she did what she was tempted to do, she would become the Lord of the Rings, and the one cannot be used for good, it can only be used for evil, and she would therefore become evil. So it's not as if the three were immune to Sauron's power, it's just that they were kept out of his reach, and they were never used at a point when he could have controlled the bearers. All right, let's move on to the next question. Okay, so the next question, and this is a really interesting situation that arose here. The next question comes in by the request of Geralt von Riva, who asked me a question that I wrote a whole answer for, and then later on left a comment that put his question into a completely different context, which actually greatly changes the question and actually makes it very short and simple, but I had written a whole thing. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to read you the question as he originally wrote it, and I'm going to tell you what my original answer to him was with the information given, and then I'm going to tell you, how a question and answer can change drastically when given a little bit of extra context here, and that's sometimes context is incredibly important, and how this made a long and detailed answer change into a very simple one. So Geralt here asked, in the Fall of Gondolin book, Tuor suspects or mentions that a fairy creature made a scream or sound. Are there fairies? So the easy answer to the question is that there is no such passage as far as I could tell. So I'll get into the idea of fairies in the early legendarium in a bit. Let me address the idea that there was a reference like this in the Fall of Gondolin. I looked. It's not there. I could not personally remember Tuor speaking of thinking that a fairy made a screaming sound. Of course, believe it or not, my mind is filled with a great many things other than Tolkien's work. And I do not have the so-called perfect recall or eidetic memory. And I actually really don't like it when people, leave a comment and say something like, well, I don't remember reading that. And, in this sort of dismissive sort of tone, they'll be, because I'll talk about something that happened, and sometimes it's not something obscure. And they'll be like, I don't remember reading that. Like, okay, I do. So, what does that have to do with anything? There was one point where somebody says, they demanded to know where I got this from, what sort of crazy, obscure book I got this one part of an answer from. And I said, oh, it's a really obscure book. You might not have it. It's called The Lord of the Rings, So it wasn't, oh, thank you for the subscribe. That doesn't happen all that often while I'm recording. Okay, there it goes. Sometimes that happens where somebody doesn't remember something from The Lord of the Rings, and because they don't remember it, they don't think it happened, so that I don't like when people do that, because I'm not saying that you should always just take me at my word and believe everything I say, because I can make mistakes too, but if you're finding something, well, I don't remember that, well, maybe read it again. That's, that's the best way I could tell you. And then if I'm wrong, tell me, please. So, what I did here is I have a digital copy of The Fall of Gondolin, and the great things about having these digital copies is that you can search for certain words or phrases. So I searched for the word fairy, in the Fall of Gondolin, and the only mention, in the entire, PDF file that I have is in his bibliography, it mentions that he wrote on fairy stories. The word does not appear in the text at all. So then I searched for fairies, because that's a different word, it's spelled differently, and there was only a single mention, which is this line here. And thus did all the fates of the fairies weave then to one strand, and that strand is the great tale of Eärendil, and to that tale's true beginning as we now come. So there's no mention of Tuor or any sort of screaming, so I searched for fairy, spelled Faerie, and that pops up quite a lot, but it's always referring to a land, because Aemon, or the Undying Lands, or Elvenhome, was once referred to in earlier texts as Fairy, or sometimes Faerie. And the name even appeared in The Hobbit. So every mention is of a land, not of a people or a creature. This is inclusive to both pronunciations as well as the spelling Faery. So then I thought to myself, well, maybe the person asking the question here has that other version. There's this digital version out there floating around on the internet called The Fall of Gondolin, and it actually came out before the actual Fall of Gondolin book, and it's sort of cobbled together by fans out of text from various sources, and that didn't work out either because no mention of fairies in this context was made. As a matter of fact, that the fact that fan-made book doesn't mention fairies or of any sort of spelling or pronunciation. So then I thought, well, maybe it's Book of Lost Tales Part 2, from which a part of the Fall of Gondolin is derived, but there's nothing there that mentioned the description giving. No screaming attributed to fairies by Tuor, no mention of fairies of any spelling anywhere near Tuor. Maybe the wording was different, so instead of scream, I searched for scream, in the Fall of Gondolin, the word doesn't appear. It does appear in a section about Tuor, but it's mentioning a serpent, that is to say a dragon, screaming when hewn by Tuor. The Book of Lost Tales has the word a second time, but just clarifying that the serpent was a fire drake in a note from Christopher Tolkien. So no such passage exists as far as I can tell. Maybe you're just not remembering it correctly. So fairies are mentioned quite a bit in the Book of Lost Tales, and not in the section regarding the Fall of Gondolin as much as it is in Beren and Luthien and other, early Silmarillion tales. Tinuviel, Twinwelland, and Gwendoling are given as names of specific fairies, names that would later refer to Luthien and her parents, who would later be named Thingol and Melian. Elwing is also called a fairy in this early work. Note that Beren is called an elf in the early Beren and Luthien. Elves and fairies were two types of the same creature. Beren was different from Luthien or her parents, with the note that Twinwelland was a wood fairy, which would later be revised to Sindar. The decision to change the story so that Beren was a man came later, as well as Luthien's mother becoming a Maya, an angelic creature, rather than a fae creature. It can all be summed up in one simple passage. Elvish is a later emendation of fairy. There is also a note stating that Tolkien changed them from fairies to elves to try to make them seem more like people. He apparently was rather annoyed at Legolas being drawn by artists to seem extremely feminine, though Tolkien himself was the one that stated that it was hard to tell an elf man and an elf woman apart. His mind changed back and forth on a great many things over time. It should also be noted that a lot of the early versions of the Fall of Gondolin contain the word gnome as a type of elf as well. And as Tolkien's friends read his work, they couldn't get the sort of garden gnome visual out of their head. So Tolkien changed gnome to Noldor, which was later Noldor. Some people have suggested that modern tales of fairies and fae may be referring to the fated elves of Tolkien's mythological past, and as they lost their bodies from staying in Middle-earth for too long, they changed form. This may or may not have been in the author's intent, and even if it was, I mentioned earlier that he changed his mind a lot, but it's certainly an interesting thought. The Hobbit mentions a Hobbit legend that the ancestors of the Tooks, one of the ancestors of the Tooks, I should say, married a fairy, which may or may not have been a word that the hobbits used to describe elves, and this led to the Tooks, being the way they are. But while Bilbo dismisses it as nonsense, there may or may not have been a kernel of truth to it. And if you're ever interested, go to my Quora account and look at my answers, and there's one pinned about the origin of hobbits. The possible origin of hobbits is a whole thing that I wrote, and how it all ties into this idea of a fairy. Very interesting read, which I recommend. So that was the way that I originally answered this question. But then he got back to me, and I'm going to read you his comment. Actually, I'm not going to read you his entire comment because it's quite long. But essentially, and this is an important thing to tell me, he wasn't reading the English version of The Fall of Gondolin. He was reading it in German. And when we put our heads together and talked to each other, we came to the conclusion that this was a mistranslation. Now, of course, some of the early works that were published in many other languages around the world, like The Hobbit and The Lord of the Rings, the translations in all these different languages are very, very good because Tolkien oversaw a lot of it. But now we're talking about works published well after he died. So, of course, he could not oversee the translations and make sure that, incorrect words didn't get used. So, the passage, which I'm not going to try to read, he posted it in German, and I'm not sure that my well, I'm going to try it. I'm not sure that my German is very good here. I'm probably going to mispronounce a few things, but this is what it is. Eines Tages, als Thor ein großes Stück Wegs zurückgelegt hatte und müde von Gehen war man an tiefen Abend einen Schrei, und konnte sich nicht schlüssig werden, von welchen Wesen stimme. Zuerst meinte es sei ein Fiengeschöpf, dann glaubte es sei nur ein kleines Tier. I sort of wish I had my friend Elise with me because she's fluent in German. I'm certainly not. But that's from the German publication of The Fall of Gondolin. And the issue here is the phrase Fiengeschöpf, which Fien means fairy in German, and that's where Geralt got the idea that it said fairy there. But now that I knew which section of the book it was, because he told me, what page it was on and everything, or rather he told me sort of vaguely where it was, I found it in English, and what Tolkien had written was fey creature, which could be any number of things. And I'm going to talk about that a little bit here. The fey creature in this instance was what Tolkien referred to as a sprite in his poetic works. In the very early versions of the Legendarium, there were sort of three tiers of angels, the Ainur. There was the Valar, then there was the Maiar, and then there was an even lesser angel. And these lesser angels were divided into three categories. There was the sprites, the sylphs, and the mermaids. The sprites were sort of the ones that were of the earth, and the sylphs were of the air, and the mermaids, of course, of the water, of the oceans. And they mostly got written out because this was Tolkien, very young Tolkien's sensibilities, and as he grew up, his sensibilities changed, and he didn't want to have sprites and sylphs and mermaids in the stories. So some of the ideas became elves, and some of them became Maiar and such like that. So, when I went back and forth with Geralt, and what he says is that based on what I showed him in the English version of The Fall of Gondolin, is they should have used the word nympha in German, because that would be, better in the context there. So we've discovered here that basically the German translation's a little bit confusing there, because that's the thing. The word fairy is used a lot in The Fall of Gondolin, the early primitive versions, and they're almost always referring to the beings that we call elves. When they say fairy, they say gnome. Gnome is Noldor. Wood fairy is Sindar. And like I said, The Fall of Gondolin is very interesting because you're getting a lot of different versions of the same story, sort of like with the Beren and Luthien book. But there you have it. This is how a little bit of extra context completely changes it, where I would say, oh, that's a mistranslation, instead of going on and on about, fairies and whatnot. But I hope you found that interesting anyway. Anyway, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Alex Barredo, who asks, what was the role of Grimbeorn and the rest of the Beornings during the War of the Ring? While I think it would be nice to imagine Grimbeorn and his followers joining King Brand and Dane the Second Ironfoot in battle against the Easterlings, much as his father, Beorn, joined Bard and Thorin, and of course Dane as well in the Battle of the Five Armies, we aren't told that such a thing took place, and I think it's unlikely. The only mention of Grimbeorn the Old and his followers, the Beornings, was in Book 2 of The Lord of the Rings, before the War of the Ring had really started in earnest. Later on, in Appendix A, we're given a bit more detail about the invasion in the north, as the main text followed the Hobbits, and as such, only the war in the south was described in detail, and the deaths of King Brand and Dane the Second Ironfoot. No mention of Grimbeorn or his Beornings is made in the appendix, nor in any other published work by Tolkien. So we can make a bit of an educated guess based on the one mention of Grimbeorn the Old that exists, which is the following. Throughout the rest of the meal they talked together, but Frodo listened more than he spoke, for the news of the Shire apart from the ring seemed small and far away and unimportant, while Gloin had much to tell of events in the northern regions of Wilderland. Frodo learned that Grimbeorn the Old, son of Beorn, was now the lord of many sturdy men, and to their land between the mountains and Mirkwood neither orc nor wolf dared to go. The goal of Sauron's forces in the north is to drive all of the elves to the east, to Lindon, where they will be forced to the west, to Lindon, the east. I did like a GameFAQs.com there. To drive them all to the west, to Lindon, where they will be forced to either perish in battle and thus go to the west, with capital W west, or sail to the west, leaving Middle-earth. Any and all enemies, such as men and dwarves, that stand in his way and do not join him will simply be slain or captured and enslaved if possible. The enemy is coming from Rhûn, and Erebor and Dale are the first line of defense, but they're not the only one. They're not the only line of defense. If the war had not ended there and the Easterlings had not retreated back to their homes, they would have pressed onward to Mirkwood and contended with Thranduil, and the next line of defense would be western Mirkwood and the lands west of the forest, including the Misty Mountains, guarded by Grimbeorn and his people. And then there's Elrond, and then the Shire, which is weakened heavily because the Dunedain have gone to the south to join Aragorn, and then finally Círdan. It seems likely to me that having all the forces of the Free People of Middle-earth in one location for a standoff against the invasion of Sauron's Easterlings, it sounds epic. It's also really foolish. Thranduil's people aren't very good at open warfare like that. They're better in the forest. This is the reason Thranduil's father Oropher was slain in Mordor, and Thranduil led less than a third of his people home afterwards. Having each force stay put in their home territory, it gives them a better advantage because it's their home territory. Of course, the point was not to win the war against the Easterlings, but to hold off Sauron's forces as long as possible until the One Ring was destroyed. This was the only hope of victory. Note that as soon as the ring's destruction happened, Sauron's forces, they either scattered or they retreated or they went mad. The Easterlings just stopped and went home. It wasn't really their war. They weren't interested in this. They were compelled into Sauron's service, and with his power broken, they had no interest in fighting for him. But without this event, the forces of Rhûn, which seemed endless, would sweep over the north, and Aragorn's small force in the south would eventually succumb as well. All right, let's move on to the next question. Okay, the next question comes in from Fernando Alberto, who asks, are the first three elves, Imintata and Enel, still alive? Yes. Every elf that has ever lived, with the exception of Luthien, is alive. And before I go into more detail, some people were commenting on this and saying, well, what about Arwen? What about Arwen? I have to just kind of point out from one of Tolkien's letters where he said Arwen was not an elf in the strictest sense of things. She's Perithal. She's a half-elf that had a choice. Luthien didn't have a choice. Luthien was given this sort of choice but not by the Valar, but by Ilúvatar himself. But Luthien was different because she was fully an elf, or I should say, she had no mortal ancestry. Her mother was an angel. So I wouldn't say she's fully an elf. But Luthien has no mortal ancestry. Arwen does. So that's why there's a difference there. But all of the elves, full-blooded elves that have no mortal ancestry, are still alive because the elves are immortal. They don't ever die. Their bodies can be damaged to a point as to no longer be fit to house their spirits, which is a bodily death, but they never depart from the world as mortals do. We read that a little bit ago in letter 131 at the beginning of the video. Instead, their spirits are drawn to a place called Mandos, and will, if allowed by Namo, who is sort of the keeper there of Mandos, to the point where the elves just usually called him Mandos, they'll be given a new body identical to their old ones. Elves rarely age past maturity, and they never get sick, as decreed by Eru Ilúvatar. That's God with a capital G. They are bound to persist within the world, no matter what, until its conclusion. So all of the original elves are either alive at every point in the Legendarium. They're just not important parts of the story. It should be mentioned that there were not 3 original elves. There were 144 original elves. It's just that these 3 were the first to awaken and the first to be given names. And, and their names are sort of a counting thing. Imin means 1, Tata means 2, Enel means 3. In the primitive Quendian, though the meanings of the latter 2 would later be shifted to father and between. We can make strong surmise as to the whereabouts of these 3 elves based on what happened to their followers. Imin's followers, which were called the Minyar, or the first ones, later became known as the Vanyar, with Imin's descendant Ingwa becoming the king of the Vanyar and the high king of all the elves. As the Vanyar all made their way to the Undying Lands, I can assume that this is where Imin is. He's in the Undying Lands somewhere. Tata's followers were called the Tatyar, which means the second ones, and later they were split between the Noldor and the Avari. So it's sort of a coin flip. Tata either went to the Undying Lands or he stayed in Middle-earth. In this case, I would find it likely that he stayed in Middle-earth. Then there's Enel, and his people were called the Nelyar, which means third ones, and they became the Teleri. Now, the Teleri have many subtypes. So if Enel made it to the Undying Lands, he may be considered Falmari, or otherwise he may be considered Sindar or Nandor, depending on his movements in Middle-earth. The only exception to Elves Don't Die is Luthien, who was given mortality as a divine gift from Ilúvatar. The other side of the coin would be Tur, who was the only man with no elvish ancestry whatsoever to become immortal and thus be counted amongst the Eldar. Of course, there were mortals that became immortal that had elvish ancestry. There were Eärendil and Elwing, but Tur didn't have, he was before them. He was their ancestor that was on the mortal side. And, there, of course, were several Perithal, half-elves who died, but the Perithal were mortal, accepting of those given a choice and who chose immortality. Eärendil and Elwing. All right, let's move on to the next question. The next question comes in from Danny Linder, who asks, this is a really interesting question. I never thought I'd see this one. Who is the third oldest being in Middle-earth? That's an interesting question. It's difficult to ascertain age in some cases, as the definition of age can vary. For example, Treebeard refers to Gandalf and Saruman as young, which is a ridiculous notion because Gandalf and Saruman are older than the universe. Is it that Treebeard simply does not know this? Or that he's referring to their incarnated bodies, which are much younger than Treebeard. I also find it curious that we're looking for third oldest, not the oldest, and I think he really can't answer this without just giving like the top 3, I think. So, it's curious and interesting to say the least. It is also mentioned that we're looking for the oldest in Middle-earth, not the whole of Arda or Tolkien's universe. So as such, I'm going to say we're going to discount Ilúvatar because, he would not reside in Arda until he would manifest himself as Christ. Tolkien claimed that Ilúvatar was always present in The Lord of the Rings, but that he would not walk the earth until he manifested as Christ. So, he's not physically there. So let's, at what point are we asking this too? That's another, let's say it's the end of the Third Age. That's our waypoint. Who is the third oldest, or I should say the top 3 oldest at the point when Frodo's getting ready to sail to the west? So Gandalf and all the other Maiar spirits in the land were created all at the, exactly at the same time, but they predate the universe, and they come from a location known as the Timeless Halls. So I would state that they're born into the world when they come into the world. The concept of time didn't exist prior to that. Thus, Gandalf is equally as old as Radagast and the surviving shades of Saruman and Sauron, if you want to count them, not to mention any, if the Blue Wizards are still out there, or if there's any Balrogs left out there. However, I would put them all like a tie for second oldest. The oldest would be Tom Bombadil. He was in Arda and even in Middle-earth before the Ainur came into it. So with Bombadil being the oldest, and Gandalf and Radagast and any other Maiar tooling around out there being all tied for second, who's the third? And I would say here that we can't really tell, but there are 2 possibilities. There's Treebeard and there's Círdan the Mariner. It's difficult to say which is older. Treebeard seems to be the oldest living Ent, and he may very well be one of the first Ents to awaken in Middle-earth, but the elves woke up before the Ents. Círdan might be a first-generation elf, one of the original 144 who awoken, but he might not be. He might have been second or third generation. Of course, Treebeard also states that there are trees in his own forest that are older than he is. But you're looking for a name. You're not looking for, well, that tree over there is the third oldest creature. So let's say we're limiting this to speaking creatures. I would personally hazard a guess that Círdan is probably older than Treebeard. We're not given a date for either of their births or awakenings, but we do know that the elves were around before the Ents were. Knowing this, if Círdan is a first or second generation elf, I would say that it's very likely he's older than Treebeard. Of course, there is a chance that this is incorrect and that Treebeard is older, and this might be backed up by Celeborn referring to Treebeard as eldest, though he may be referring to him as the eldest Ent. I would say that while my personal thought is that Círdan is the third oldest, that takes that number 3 spot there, it's kind of a 50-50 shot, so you can choose, which you believe is the older and therefore the third oldest being in Middle-earth. Of course, Círdan would eventually sail to the west in the Fourth Age, and if we do not count the likes of Sauron and Saruman as being alive, or any unknown Balrogs are out there, we could say that after Círdan sailed to the west, and assuming Treebeard is still alive, which he likely is, it would be Bombadil, and then Radagast, and also possibly the Blue Wizards tied in there as well, and Treebeard being the third. So that's the best I could do for you there. I did look into this quite a lot. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of Viking to Katana, who asks, would you rather have Gandalf as your mentor, Galadriel as your guide, or Aragorn as your protector? So I love questions like this because there isn't really a correct answer. Everybody's going to have their own choice based on their own feelings. And my heart says Galadriel. Aragorn as a protector, that's great, but I would wonder, well, what exactly is he protecting me from? Am I in danger? And if Aragorn maybe had something bigger to attend to, maybe he won't be there all the time to protect me from whatever it is that I need protection from. Gandalf as a mentor, that sounds really great, and I was tempted to pick Gandalf on this. But once again, he's got a lot going on. He would be constantly flitting off to deal with this or that and not answering all of my questions to my satisfaction. I would feel very much like Pippin in that instance. So with Galadriel, you get both. You get the protection in form of the umbrella created by her ring, Nenya, as well as her wisdom and guidance. And, she might not be eternal like Gandalf is, but she's an 8,000-year-old immortal who has pretty much seen it all. Not only this, but a lot of time she's a package deal with her husband Celeborn, and it's mentioned a few times in the text that Celeborn is supposed to be very wise. And I would admit, I'm somewhat curious how he got this reputation. I don't get a lot of his wisdom in The Lord of the Rings, so picking his mind would be an opportunity to find out, what does he know, what is his wisdom. I would love to know that. So plus, I could probably eat more lembas than Gimli could. All right, let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in by the request of the Mango Guy, who asks, is the term Hobbit in the public domain in European countries such as Romania? The word isn't in the public domain in such that it is not copyrighted. Words cannot be copyrighted. However, it is trademarked, which is a bit different. People have tried to claim that Tolkien did not invent the term Hobbit, but every sign points that he did. And no proof of it existing previous seems to exist. It may have been inspired by a story called Babbitt by Sinclair Lewis, and Tolkien absolutely read Babbitt because he was a fan of Sinclair Lewis, and he read everything by him. And we're going to go back to his letters here. Letter 25, Tolkien replies to a letter from the editor of the Observer, who asks him if the term Hobbit was inspired by furry pygmies in Africa, and that's something that Tolkien denied ever even hearing of, and I couldn't find any other reference to furry pygmies in Africa other than this letter, or perhaps a story called The Hobbit, which was described as this sort of horror tale in a book of fairy tales published in 1904. So Tolkien stated that he never heard of any such story either, and it doesn't seem to exist. I couldn't find any reference to a book of fairy tales published in 1904 that has a story called The Hobbit. The reason that the Observer was asking this of Tolkien, because they had received a letter from someone who asked them these questions, and they didn't know. So they said, well, let's ask Tolkien. He's good at replying to letters. So the person that wrote the letter to the Observer signed under a pseudonym. He called himself The Habit. So we don't really know who it was, and their account of these furry pygmies being seen in Africa and being called hobbits, it's unsubstantiated. And their claim of reading a story from 1904 called The Hobbit, it seems fake to me. Because it's sort of like my friend remembered reading this story, and it was called The Hobbit, and it was really scary. Did Tolkien get the name from that? No name of a volume was given. No other information was given. It was probably just all made up by somebody who didn't even use a real name. And it's actually reminded me of something. A long time ago, I did these movie reviews, and I don't want to get into too much detail here, but I reviewed a film, and there was one person who was very upset with my review because he felt that I didn't like the movie as much as he did. Like, I gave it a fairly above average review, just a little above average rating, and he thought it was spectacular. And he couldn't just disagree like a normal person, or he couldn't even disagree like an abnormal person who might just sort of fling insults and call you all sorts of names. But instead, he tried to claim that I plagiarized the review from a book of movie reviews that his brother had, and that he called up his brother, and his brother read a part of the book to him, and it matched my review exactly, and so I must have taken it. So, of course, I was like, well, what's the name of the book? And, of course, he couldn't tell me the name of the book because, it's missing the cover, And then he eventually admitted that was all made up as some sort of ploy to annoy me, which I guess that was quite successful. But there you have it. There's a lot of other stories related to that particular individual because that's where the story started. Where it ends is completely insane, but I'm not going to talk about it here. But I just wanted to say that it reminded me of that. Like, oh, my brother had this book of old movie reviews, and you took it from him, and I can't tell you the name of it. My friend read this thing called The Hobbit in 1904. The word Hobbit, well, let's talk about it. Tolkien invents the word Hobbit, and he invented a lot of words, some of which are in common usage in English, such as the word tween, though the meaning has changed from what he intended. He was talking about hobbits in their 20s. We're talking about children that are not quite teenagers, but almost there. So what you're really asking is, can you use the word hobbit? And I just used it several times. I used it a lot, actually. I wrote a whole thing about the origins of hobbits, which I talked about earlier. Nothing prevents me from using the word hobbit. Nothing prevents you from using the word hobbit. You can't copyright a single word. The word hobbit is under no copyright. The book The Hobbit, which is... that's the Two Towers. Oh, never mind. I don't know. That's copyrighted. You can't print your own version of The Hobbit and then sell it. However, the word Hobbit is trademarked, and this doesn't mean that you can't use the word in a work of your own, but that it comes with some restrictions. For example, if you're writing a story and a character mentions reading The Hobbit, that's fine. If your character is a big fan of hobbits, that's fine. If your character role plays as a hobbit, that's fine. If your character is a hobbit, now we're starting to tread dangerous waters. The trademark held by Middle-earth Enterprises can be interpreted as such. You can write about hobbits, but they cannot be Tolkien's hobbits. If you write about hobbits, they have to be distinct in some way. This is the reason that Dungeons and Dragons got in trouble. They had these furry-footed little guys, and they were just too close to Tolkien's furry-footed little guys, and they were henceforth. They had to change it from hobbit to halfling. And that's a word that is in use by Tolkien, but he didn't invent it. There's no sort of trademark there. You can write about fantastical creatures called hobbits, but they have to be different enough from Tolkien's hobbits so that nobody would confuse the two. This is true in any country, though some countries are a little bit more bullish than others about pursuing these sorts of legal issues. And just a disclaimer, not a lawyer, not legal advice. Let's move on to the next question. Our next question comes in from Mickey, who asks, how was Hobbit society changed long-term by the Scouring of the Shire? Hobbit society changed in several minor ways. For the most part, their lifestyle remained the same, though. In the short term, there was an obvious loss of life, though the hobbits won the Battle of Bywater, successfully scouring the Shire. Several hobbits died. There also was several that were imprisoned or murdered before the scouring, most notably Frodo's cousin, Lotho Sackville Baggins. It was also mentioned that many hobbits were made homeless, something that was rectified mostly by Frodo, with a little bit of help from Lotho's mother, Lobelia, who left her estate to Frodo to help him fix things. Frodo became deputy mayor, while the actual mayor, Will Whitfoot, was recuperating from his ordeal because he was locked up during that whole thing. And after Whitfoot's term was up, Samwise became mayor for the next 49 years. The damage was eventually repaired through the efforts of the hobbits, with Frodo as deputy mayor and an aristocrat using his wealth to help the needy. Sam is the mayor, Pippin's the thane, Merry's the master of Buckland. Aragorn played a role as well, because he's technically he's the king of the Shire, though he's not only, did he respect the Shire folks' autonomy, but he expanded their autonomy. A law was passed in the reunited kingdom that the land known as the Shire, which now included Westmarch, would be off limits to the big people. For the most part, though, Hobbit life didn't change very much. They bounced back. It was noted that they had an unusually large amount of blonde children, which is a hair color that's rare for hobbits born in one specific year, and this was coupled with a really good harvest in that year. The hobbits had defended their lands from invaders in the past, such as the wargs and the goblins, but with the role of several hobbits in the War of the Ring and their growing notoriety, they were now more worldly and respected by the rest of Middle-earth, and they became, of course, more interested in the outside world as well. All right, let's move on to the final question. Our final question comes in from, I hope I'm saying it right, Yoi Yuri, who asks, are there any Falmari that appear in The Lord of the Rings or The Hobbits? Kinda, yeah. Well, in The Lord of the Rings, anyway. The Falmari are one of the different types of Teleri elves. And the phrase almost always refers specifically to the Falmari that live on the shores of Aemon, in the Undying Lands, which would preclude any of them from being in either The Hobbit or The Lord of the Rings. But there's a little wiggle room here. Falmari means wave folk, and they are mentioned in The Hobbit briefly in an aside where Bilbo, as the narrator, describes how the sea elves, the light elves, and the deep elves traveled to the west to a place called Fairy. The deep elves refers to the Noldor, the light elves are the Vanyar, and Bilbo refers to the Teleri as the sea elves, and it's not 100% accurate, though he wrote his story before he'd become a scholar of elvish lore, so, it's fine. Teleri literally means the third ones, and the ones that were the sea elves were the ones who made the journey and lived by the sea, but there were a great other type of Teleri who did not, a great amount of other types of Teleri who did not, the chief kind being the Sindar and the Nandor. So Bilbo is still mostly correct here. He refers to the elves that have gone over to the west, but he's comparing them to the wood elves, which are mostly Sylvan, which is a type of Nandor elf, led by the Sindar king Thranduil, so they're all Teleri. So generally, Falmari refers to elves that went to the west and stayed there, but there are 2 points that give us a little wiggle room here. The first point is that Celeborn, who is a minor character in The Lord of the Rings, was originally viewed as a Sindar, therefore he is Teleri, of the Teleri that did not make it to the Undying Lands and they lived in Beleriand. But later in life, Tolkien was greatly concerned with the character of Galadriel. Galadriel was created specifically for The Lord of the Rings, but in creating such an old and important character, he realized that she absolutely needed to have a big role in the Silmarillion. You may note that in the published version of the Silmarillion, Galadriel and her husband Celeborn are not really very important to the story, but Tolkien was trying to find a way to integrate her as a greater part of the story when he died. Unfortunately, he never finished this other version of Galadriel and Celeborn's origin when he died. The idea included reinventing Celeborn not as a Sindar noble from Doriath, but rather a Falmar prince who lived in Alqualondë. This also involved Galadriel already living there with him. They were already married, and she fought against her kin, the Noldor, led by her uncle Feanor, and then pursued them to Middle-earth against the wishes of the Valar. The idea was never fully fleshed out, but if you choose to believe this origin, that would make Celeborn a Falmar prince. The other possible idea is Círdan the Mariner. Like Celeborn, he's Sindar. He's the very oldest of the Sindar who remained in Middle-earth. Círdan was a bit different from the other Sindar, while most of them just stopped in Beleriand and they never went to the west, with the exception of Thingol, who actually did go to the west and then came back to try to convince his people how wonderful it is there, and then he fell in love with Melian and he stayed. Círdan was actually trying to get there. He was trying to finish the journey, and he wound up essentially missing his ride twice. The Peoples of Middle-earth mentions that some people refer to Círdan and his people as Falmari, as they lived by the shores of Beleriand, and later in the only remaining part of Beleriand that is attached to Middle-earth, called Lindon. This is etymologically correct, as the word for shorelines is phallus, so referring to Círdan as a sea elf, it's technically correct, as he is a mariner that lives at the shoreline. And it is also somewhat culturally correct because he is Teleri. This would mean that any Teleri elf who lives by the sea may be called a Falmari if you wish to do that. Well, anyway, that was all the questions for this week. I had a lot of fun. I think this episode might have gone a little long, but that's fine. Send me some questions, leave me some comments, hit the like button, subscribe if you haven't already, and if you want to support the channel in a greater way, consider maybe joining as a member, because it's very cheap and you get to see all the videos early, and you get some emotes and badges and stuff that you can see on live streams, which we are live streaming nearly every Thursday. And of course I will be posting schedules for what the Thursday streams are going to be in the community tab, so keep an eye on that as well. Especially since if I tell you now, well, the members are going to hear it pretty much like tomorrow when I edit this video and put it up, but then everybody else will hear it a week after, so it'll be a little bit outdated. So just keep an eye on the community tab for schedules, but it's going to be most Thursdays. Anyway, guys, we'll see you next time.